While we're dreaming about that perfect future, we're ignoring the chaotic realities. We're ignoring that strategy might be incoherent, or we're ignoring that vendors are running wild across our organization. We're ignoring that we have data breaches waiting to happen because no one's governing the AI-enabled cloud. And that's where governance becomes non-negotiable. It's the only force capable of moderating the extremes. Governance takes the achievable promises and builds a realistic path to make sure we can be resilient through the chaos. But utopian promises matter because they inspire us. Governance matters because it protects us.
In this mini panic situation and the FOMO of this is going too fast, we need to move, how do you actually get C-suites and board of directors excited about governance? Because I totally get it that it is what protects us. But as you may or may not know, I'm sitting here in Europe and we started this whole thing with the AI EU Act, which was all about starting with regulating and protecting even before we could imagine what was possible. And so how do you see board of directors and executive boards balancing out the inspiration and the need and desire to act with the focus on protecting it, protecting the company and putting some thought into governance?
And FinOps is providing the ability to do that because it's providing, number one, our ability to optimize using automated mechanisms, and also our ability to finally understand what the heck we're paying for. I had customers paying 6 times what they thought they were going to be paying for in the cloud, 10 years ago. And they didn't know where the money was going until they had a FinOps program in place. And finally, they figured it out. Once the visibility is there, then we can put observability around it, build it into something that's going to be much more efficient. And so that's what FinOps is at its essence. And I think FinOps is really very tactical tools in terms of cost management, but very strategic tools in understanding how policies and governance and optimization mechanisms can kind of come into play so we can continuously improve the way in which we spend the money.
Coming from Madrid, Spain, and Boston, USA, this is the AI-Dialogos podcast, where leaders talk AI. Our guests today are Meredith Stein, a global governance, risk, and compliance expert, along with David Linthicum, a top 10 cloud, AI, and cybersecurity leader with experience as both a CEO and CTO. We examined their new book, Unlocking the Power of the Cloud. Welcome to AI-Dialogos, Meredith and David. So with my co-host, Teresa Martin Retortillo, and we're very excited to have both of you on board. Congratulations on your book, Unlocking the Power of the Cloud. This is a very timely and important book. Of course, the biggest challenge with AI is governance and risk management. And I think one of the things that your book does is not only focus on that theme, but bring into play the idea of cloud. When people, especially at the leadership level, think of cloud, they think of it as technology, something that exists in the background. And I think what you do very well is to highlight the fact that when we think about AI, but all software development now, the substrate, the backbone really is the cloud. And so at the leadership level, there has to be a fundamental understanding of how the cloud works, both in a technical sense, but especially tying it into governance and risk management. Let me start with the way you frame it in the introduction. The way you describe it is the starting point for most organizations today around AI and the cloud is what you call utopian promises. What do you mean by that, and why does that matter for governance and risk management?
I have this vision in my head. I'm picturing sitting in a vendor presentation, and they're showing me slides about AI transforming the entire business. Limitless innovation, 5% or 5 times the returns, costs cut in half, everything looks perfect and amazing. That's the utopian promise. But the problem is that it's designed to make me fall in love with the imaginary perfect state. Not saying that the promises are lies. I think they're achievable. And they certainly give us an expansion of our vision about what is the art of the possible. But they're almost fatal guides to achieving cloud and AI transformation. Because while we're dreaming about that perfect future, we're ignoring the chaotic realities. We're ignoring that strategy might be incoherent, or we're ignoring that vendors are running wild across our organization. We're ignoring that we have data breaches waiting to happen because no one's governing the AI-enabled cloud. And that's where governance becomes non-negotiable. It's the only force capable of moderating the extremes. Governance takes the achievable promises and builds a realistic path to make sure we can be resilient through the chaos. But utopian promises matter because they inspire us. Governance matters because it protects us.
Yeah, and just to add to that, I was with a dozen or so CIOs last week when I was speaking at a conference and doing a corporate event, and spent about 4 hours with them trying to hear what their issues are. And right now they feel that they're missing out or basically behind the curve on what AI is supposed to provide them. In other words, their board of directors and their investors and their employees are screaming at them, to go faster with AI because of the utopian promises that are being made. In other words, using AI as a true force multiplier for their business. And the reality is there's so much work that has to be done around that. One of the things that, came back as a common pattern, they don't even know what steps to start marching in. They have different governance that needs to be put in place, different security systems, different operation systems. And by the way, do so with the same budget you had for the last 4 years, and you can't increase any kind of spending moving forward. And so they're rather concerned that they're not going to be able to achieve it. And it's weird. I've never seen a place in the industry right now, and I've been doing this for 35, 40 years, where we're so far over our skis in terms of what's being hyped in the hype narrative versus what AI is able to provide, and also the blocking and tackling that need to be done to make AI work in your business. And people are in a kind of a mini panic right now.
In this mini panic situation and the FOMO of this is going too fast, we need to move, how do you actually get C-suites and board of directors excited about governance? Because I totally get it that it is what protects us. But as you may or may not know, I'm sitting here in Europe, and we started this whole thing with the AI EU Act, which was all about starting with regulating and protecting even before we could imagine what was possible. And so how do you see board of directors and executive boards balancing out the inspiration and the need and desire to act with the focus on protecting it, protecting the company and putting some thought into governance? Very challenging.
You're right, Teresa. I think there's a massive mounting pressure for board members to get AI and cloud literate and get excited about the technology. And I think it's up to management to make sure that the board is cloud and AI literate and not just check the box. It's a real deep understanding about what's happening in the organization, because if the board lacks a real understanding of the cloud and AI, I think it would fail its basic duty of care. And they have to have the technical expertise and provide that oversight to make sure that those types of strategic implications are happening and they help make informed decisions.
I think one of the things when you started the conversation was interesting to me is how do you present the governance concept to them? The reality is governance is a loaded word for board of directors. They have directing governance and, pay governance and things like that they have to manage on a daily basis. And I typically wrap it into the business case. I don't really present governance or security or operations to them because, I think there's few there that are going to be literate as to what it is. Others are not necessarily going to pay attention to what I'm saying. I'm trying to get a communication to them in ways that they understand. You got to read the room. You got to figure out who's there and how they communicate, and you get directly to the benefits. And so if you get into this long discussion about the benefits of governance and active and passive governance, all these sorts of things, their eyes are going to glaze over. You're not going to get the desired response from them. So ultimately, you have to sell it as a bundle of value, and that's the only way they're going to pay attention to you. That's just my experience, by the way.
Governance at the executive board and within the company itself, generally perceived as this is going to slow things. This is going to be complicated and it's hard to keep. And we're going to talk some more about this today. The legal teams and the finance teams and the IT teams all align. And so how do you actually get space to address governance issues right at the start?
I think at the end of the day, again, you have to go to the benefits of it and how it exists in the work breakdown structure, and get to the details behind it, how much it's going to cost, why it costs what it does, and the money that's able to save. And you got to remember, governance unto itself is not necessarily something that's going to be, it can operate autonomously. So it has to be there with security and operations and FinOps and all these other things that are going to be part of it. And so you really kind of need to sell the process and overall where the benefits are going to come back. Because you're right. I mean, governance is, come on, Dave, you're going to slow us down, and we got to have meetings and committees and all that kind of stuff. And that's not what it is. And certainly not what our book explained. Ultimately, it's going to have a net direct benefit, and your ability to use technology as the way to implement governance systems that are going to be automated behind the scenes. So FinOps and some of the governance, systems I deal with, and certainly with the cloud computing stuff, everything is automated, and ultimately people are abstracted away from the policies and the policy making and the policy enforcement. So you're just dealing with the good aspect of it. In other words, implementing the policies and watching control and setting the guardrails so people don't go off of them. And I think once they see that and they understand it, they're going to have a better understanding and a better attitude toward it.
One of the things that we've raised right away is this tension between what you call utopian promises. That's not necessarily all bad. It's inspiring, as Meredith emphasized. And on the other hand, we do need to bring in, I'll use your words, the reality is AI and cloud is a wicked problem, or a set of wicked problems. So what do you mean by that, and how does that reframe what leaders should actually be doing?
I had a feeling you'd like that term. And some people may think that evil or malicious is a wicked problem, and that's not it at all. It's a challenge that refuses to be solved neatly, and it could be difficult to describe because it has a lot of tangled root causes, and it certainly involves a lot of stakeholders who all want different things. And by the time people try to address it, the problem changes shape. So in our book about unlocking the power of the cloud, we boldly say that the AI-enabled cloud is a wicked problem. IT wants flexibility, finance wants cost control, legal is panicking about compliance, and the board wants strategic innovation. The competitors change, the regulations change. There's no one single correct answer. There's no checklist to follow that magically solves everything. But the breakthrough moment for the leaders and the listeners on this call is that the cloud and AI are not IT problems. They're board level and business strategy problems, and that leaders have to build a governance ecosystem that can handle that kind of constant disruption and ensure that the organization's resilient. And our book created one for listeners to govern the AI-enabled cloud intelligently. And that ecosystem means that leaders have to focus on organizational changes, ensuring that IT and legal and finance, as well as security, are making decisions together. And it means that an organization can evolve as the technology and threats change and be able to lead effectively.
So wicked problem answers are not straightforward. They're complex, multiple stakeholders, different possible answers model. Why do we need to think about AI and cloud together? I think this is one of the fundamental theses and points about your book is lots of people are thinking about AI. When we think about governance, risk management, we're thinking about AI. But I think what you're trying to do is say, hey, look, these two things go together. Can you say a little bit about that? Why are AI and cloud intimately connected?
Well, they have a symbiotic relationship. In other words, they exist with each other's help. AI can't exist without some place to process, and obviously needs a bazillion, and very expensive kind of processing to maintain, its power. And the cloud provides that. And ultimately, the cloud also benefits from the utilization of AI that becomes systemic to the cloud. In other words, operations and governance and security, all AI based at this particular time. I was at RSA a couple of weeks ago. I mean, every security solution out there, everyone, no exceptions, was always using, AI capabilities that was going to be systemic to its services, as well as some of the governance things out there, whether it's service-based, hybrid, policy-based. And ultimately, you can't really separate the two. So we have a tendency to want to put things in a nice little neat domain. In other words, we have cloud, we have AI, we have databases, all those sorts of things. Well, it's a very difficult world where you can't figure out where the AI stops and the cloud starts. And I think we have to view it that way. So, and the cost is the same. And obviously, how it's going to run, we have a dependency on the cloud-based system. We had cloud outages happen 6 months ago, and those basically stopped all the AI systems from running. So we need to understand the dependency. We need to understand that they're coupled, and we need to run them as they're coupled. I think when we try to separate them out, we're just making things too complex and then too fragile.
And to take one of Dave's terms of being a force multiplier, I think that's where this really lives, is that when we have the AI enabled cloud, that kind of infrastructure transforms the business and it creates new revenue streams and optimizes operations. That's, I think, where when you govern them together and it's the sweet spot as one integrated strategy. I think that's really important. One part of the book that we had fun researching and talking about was about cloud sprawl and a proliferation of services where the organization often doesn't even know centrally where their assets live. And one call to action that we make in the book is for leadership to create a cloud inventory. And this would also include an AI inventory, which some organizations are beginning to do, to understand what is running. If you don't know what you have, you can't secure it. And so I think that's an important part to understand why they cannot be separated.
And so just as companies try to figure out that dual cloud AI solutions, there's on the one hand, the necessity that you're describing of actually sort of making an integrated decision about the two of them. On the other hand, there is also need to diversify, to actually avoid having a single or even two providers only. And how do we then balance out the AI decisions with the cloud decisions, purchasing risk diversification perspective?
Yeah, all clouds are going to be heterogeneous based solutions. They're going to be a mix of private clouds, hybrid clouds, Microsoft, Amazon and Google. And so when I say cloud, I'm really kind of looking at a multitude, typically a multi-cloud environment. Almost everybody's going to leverage a multi-cloud deployment. And also you're going to leverage multiple AI solutions and multiple databases. And so those are going to be heterogeneous as well. That's where you deal with the complexity. But from the logical architecture point of view, and I teach this in my architecture class, ultimately, if you put them into the single conceptual domain, they're going to be much easier for you to manage. They have common services, common, objects, common processors, and the AI systems, have common mechanisms as well. And if we're able to do that through an abstraction layer, then we start removing some of the complexity. Because when you look at something like that, a multi-cloud system, we kind of went from 1,000, functional cloud services 10 years ago to 5,000 now. And so we have to deal with the complexity somehow. And if complexity isn't managed, we have no hope of getting any kind of AI stuff up and running. So we have to deal with the cloud through abstraction layers and automation. We have to deal with the AI systems through abstraction layers and automation. So it's fundamentally how we think of it. Now, the good thing, we have a bunch of tools out there that do a really good job in providing common control planes through these things. And so look at the tooling, look at the abstraction layer, and don't basically go at these heterogeneous environments on their terms, go at it on your terms. And that means, heavy governance, heavy security, and the ability to kind of push everything behind a layer where you can manage everything as a single unit.
So you take the two together and you try to put the governance around this pair, cloud AI tools. However, while it's easy to control the multi-cloud, or it would appear easier, one of the challenges that most CIOs and even business leaders are facing is the shadow AI. Like it is just way too easy for organizations to have their own AI tools. They are not part of any inventory. They don't go through any approval process. What effective system would you recommend leaders to actually make sure that shadow AI is under control?
I think that cloud inventory is certainly a weapon against cloud sprawl, and it makes my head spin why it matters so much. And if you're guessing about costs and security and compliance, it should terrify leaders who are listening to this call, because most people get it wrong that the inventory is just not a list of server names, that you're going to need hardware details, software licenses, actual use cases that are either in development or already deployed. And you need to know where your data is located, and not just geographic jurisdictions, but where is the data living right this second. It's important to have that information because it'll certainly feed directly into the security strategy. And because like Dave said, if you have multiple clouds, you have countless third parties, fourth parties, fifth parties. Our book has a really cool graphic about the extended enterprise, and that does create a lot of chaos. What helps is the zero trust model of never trust but always verify, and needing, that the idea that you have this old safe internal network perimeter, it doesn't exist anymore. That every user, every device, every single connection attempt has to be continuously verified and authorized. And that's not me being paranoid. I think it's about leaders being smart.
And the shadow AI thing is my advice to clients who have that issue, and pretty much every of them has that issue now. And based on what my research finds, it's about 75% of AI processing is actually occurring that way right now. You have two lines of defenses. Number one, create policies and publicize in public, make sure everybody understands the policies. It's legal issues as well, because in many cases you put yourself in legal jeopardy if they're using unauthorized AI tools that could end up doing things that harm the business. And so that stuff has to be put into place. And next, it would be training. In other words, tell them what's allowed and what's not allowed and which tools to use, and actually train them on the tools. And I think the mistakes that many of these organizations are making now is they're actually forbidding using any kind of AI tool. And the reality is, I think that's industrial being stupid, because they're going to use it to be more productive. So figure out a path, figure out a policy that's reasonable, understand they're going to use the tools, figuring out training in terms of how they're going to use them. And ultimately, you're going to end up with a more productive workforce. However, there should be standardization toward the tool moving forward, and you should be able to take kind of the bull by the horns and figure out which path the company needs to make. But right now, they're in a bad situation because they're pre standards and post AI since 2022. So make the best of it.
Let's go back to this frame of two different models. The status quo model, this is what typically most organizations are likely to be at. And then the model that you think where we need to be. Let's first just describe what the current status quo model is. How do organizations function today?
You might see it as the CEO saying, this is a tech problem, it's IT. It's certainly safer. The CEO may be under a misconception that it's safer to hand the risk over to the CIO. It feels easier to maybe trust the vendor promises. And for the board, I think, having a check the box that says, oh, we looked at the cloud strategy without understanding what's happening underneath it. But when something goes wrong, whether it's a data breach or a compliance violation or a massive cost overrun, it's going to be the market and the regulators and your customers that don't hold. They're not going to hold the CIO accountable. They're going to hold the entire organization accountable. They're going to hold the board accountable. The delegation model that you were describing as status quo, it's comfortable, but that's why it's dangerous, because it's a liability. But with the coordination model, we talk about this as a shared responsibility, because it's a business capability. And I think that shared responsibility model is extremely important for the cloud, the AI-enabled cloud. And Dave has a terrific perspective of this framing too.
Yeah, at the end of the day, we can continue going down a under-optimized way of using these systems. And obviously, that's going to be the path of least resistance. It's never a good thing to change within these organizations. It's painful to do it. You have to have political courage in order to drive some of these changes. However, you're not going to see any core benefits if you're not necessarily going to be up for a change. You got to remember, the AI stuff is going to change everything. And we can talk about the hyperbole around it, but ultimately we're going to be a very different world in 5 years and 10 years in terms of our ability to leverage this kind of technology. Status quo is not going to make it. In other words, we got to change our governance policies, our governance, our security, the way in which we operate the systems, the operating models in terms of how we build organizations around it. All those sorts of things need to occur now. It's going to take a lot of planning. It's going to take a lot of moving. And I have to kind of look at the Global 2000 companies out there. One of the things that they don't like doing is changing. They like status quo. That's typically going to keep their jobs, typically going to keep their salaries coming in. They're not looking to take a lot of career risks. However, by not doing that, you're definitely going to take a risk by default. And so we need to understand that. And so you have to basically take an action model over the next 5 years.
You mentioned earlier that 75% of the AI used in companies is actually shadow AI. So it hasn't gone through the proper governance approval. And what you're proposing now is that it's no longer the usual channel of IT delegated model. It is a coordinated model with even more units having to agree on the right usage of the model. So that in the definition of any executive team is actually slow, painful. Centralization and more approval steps is sort of a bad recipe for adoption and reacting to market trends. And so I get that many of the Global 2000 don't like to change, but it looks like this coordination model, it feels like a very tight guardrail relative to how businesses think about change. And so do you have a good example of companies that have actually managed to have this scale? Any good examples of companies that might be doing this already?
I do. In my work over the years, and certainly being a consultant for the last 30 years, I've run into a lot of companies that are basically attempting that. I don't think anybody is doing that well. That was something I typically would find I'd break my pick on. And there as an architect or as a technology leader, I'm obviously in many cases not the deciders, and you're trying to get lots of deciders marching in the right direction. And they're in many cases, I don't think they can get out of their own way holistically. And I'm talking about all companies all over the world. And that's a fundamental cultural issue because you got to remember we hire people and we teach them to be risk adverse. In other words, risks are bad. They're going to jeopardize your career. They're going to jeopardize the company. And just by what we're asking them to do, to make a common decision, to make a common policy, to make something provide common value, that's going to provide risk because guess what? It could fail. In fact, in many cases, it will fail. And ultimately, they're not willing to accept the risk of failure. So my guidance is to go to the board of directors and go to the CEO and kind of explain it to them. So at the end of the day, you're the one that's going to have to lead them to make these risks. They will do it, but do so under duress. In other words, there has to be an obligation. It's an emergency. We got to get this going. You got to figure this out in a very short period of time. We got to figure this out in 3 months. And if the right people are making the requests, they're going to go ahead and do it because then the risk becomes not doing it. And so everybody out there is, basically talking up a good game right now. And, we're going to use AI to change your business. We're going to be an AI-based business. We're going to get rid of all of our employees because of AI and all those sorts of things. But as far as coordinating any kind of change activity, that seems to be where they're running into issues. And I think many companies are going to end up going out of business because they're unable to make the policy changes and the strategic changes around the use of the technology, and their competitors are going to eat their lunch. So I think it's going to be forced over the next few years. But to answer your question directly, I haven't seen anybody do it well.
And it just, you just use an expression that is just so powerful to avoid governance and this coordinated model, which is the risk is not doing it. The risk is not be experimenting. The risk is not being out there with the next product. The legal team, the financial team, and the IT team are the ones that we want to avoid at all cost. So,
and I think it creates that large competitive moat that Dave was talking about, that if organizations don't try a tool out and they fail in a safe space, those that are not trying it at all because they're risk averse, they're not going to be moving forward, and they're going to create a deeper and deeper moat where the other organizations are way far ahead and they're thriving.
We were seeing industries, automobile industry would be a good instance of it. I always pick on those guys, but other innovations happen around them in terms of automating the construction and selling of cars and the technology that goes into cars. And so the automobile industry that moved tremendously slow and was very regulated, they had a tendency to get a huge bureaucracy in place, and it hurt them. In other words, everybody moved toward the electric cars, and that ended up being a bad investment for them because they weren't able to move in an agile way or able to make decisions that were really going to be what I call it the speed of need. In other words, the need for the business. So we're going to see companies that are going to be rewarded for being a bit more aggressive in your ability to change and move into different technology sets and your ability to provide governance security around that and do it at speed. You're going to see companies that don't do it ended up being natural selection. They're going to get taken out. We're seeing many of these companies in much weaker positions now. I think many of them are going to end up going out, which means they're going to be bought up by their competitors and have to leave the market. And so the people who operate in a slow, methodical way that are going to be very risk adverse aren't going to exist anymore.
Walmart, I think, is a good example of how they've been using AI and have a solid governance model where they take it from an organizational perspective and not an IT problem. They promised that their staffing levels would stay static and not fire people, and their revenues increased. They found ways that they could use the technology to transform their business. And they didn't just, move old legacy systems into the cloud. And they actually did digitally transform, not relocate. So I think I heard a thought leader in AI. His name's Tom Petro. He did a presentation and gave some case examples, and Walmart was the standout organization that did that.
It's an excellent example, Meredith. Thank you.
So on the what we've been calling the coordinated model, is it accurate to say that the term shared risk might be more appropriate instead of delegating risk to particular individual, depending on the type of risk, shared risk and responsibility? And if that's the case, can we take a concrete example of, suppose we have a chief financial officer in an organization, of how the CFO is going to act differently in the status quo model versus this shared risk coordination model? What am I going to do differently?
Well, I think ultimately you need to get a different kind of operating expectations around how these decisions are going to be made. In other words, you're in a coordination model. You're all participating in making a decision. We're all going to be rewarded if the decision is successful, and we're all going to be punished if the decision is not. And so that needs to be communicated somehow. In my world, when I ran companies, I never wanted to do anything other than the shared coordination model. Everybody had a responsibility to participate in making many of the decisions that are going to affect the company and affect them. However, that's not the way that they're taught in business school. They're taught in business school is to, be very methodical in terms of how you deal with risk, how you deal with opportunities, and ultimately not exposing yourself to any of those sorts of things. I don't think that's the right way to do it. So with the coordination model, you're going to have people who are risk adverse, but you're going to have them take risk and have to have them take risks as a team. The delegation model is kind of cool with that because I can centralize decisions and therefore I can just give it to a risky risk taker, within the company, and they're going to go ahead and take the risk. Of course, they may, run the company off the road. But ultimately, if you have a coordination model, you have lots of people who know about different aspects of the business that are making the decisions. So the decisions are typically going to be stronger and better thought out. But you just need to create a culture in terms of how that's going to be done. Sometimes I said I should have got a psychology degree versus a computer science degree, because ultimately I ended up, having these kinds of training sessions, become a change agent within these environments, from the old school way of running a company to the new school way of running a company. And you have to think differently in terms of how you're going to approach it. So the coordination models can work, but you got to have somebody who's able to put them together and drive consensus. Because if you don't have a consensus driver, you just have a meeting by committees, you're never going to get something done. And many companies, unfortunately, are at that place right now. They're still trying to drive coordination and acceptance. They're not driving consensus, and it's taking them too long to make these decisions.
And from the board of directors position, I mentioned that it's not just a check the box exercise and we move on to the next agenda topic, but they have to be asking the right questions. And our book has a great list for board members to do that. So how does our AI strategy align with mission outcomes? What are the real costs of the AI-enabled cloud? What kind of vendor concentration risks do we have? We have an example in there where one large organization was mapped just to one cloud AI vendor, and their costs overran by hundreds of millions of dollars, and they were concentrated on that particular risk. I'm sure the board would also want to know how they're measuring the value that they're supposed to be unlocking through all of this. The idea of not having decisions be made in a silo. Some organizations have a best practice of having a center of excellence to make sure that legal, IT, compliance, finance, and security are all working at the same time. And going back to that zero trust factor where, your everything is built on that foundation, and ensuring that that organization is cyber resilient. Our ecosystem tries to talk about how it's just not one document that's placed in a drawer and sits there forever. It's not a checklist. That shared accountability, making sure everyone understands both the risks and the opportunities. Because if the organization's not taking risks, they're not getting the opportunities to expand their revenue and grow.
It feels like the questions in your book are spot on. You also mentioned that there is a need for minimum digital or AI literacy at the board level. Can you elaborate on that? What would you consider that minimum level of AI literacy for a director?
I mean, I think that there are opportunities for them to learn and for management to help teach them about, even some of the basics and even getting comfortable with it. Act that AI is your coworker and friend and be comfortable with it and see what the power is there. I think that there are definitely opportunities for management to understand that if they're finding that a particular board member is not getting it, that they need to figure out how to either replace that board member or get other board members on there who are digitally literate, and that it is possible and absolutely necessary to have that competitive advantage.
Total.
My role as a CTO within, the public companies I worked for over the years was ABT, always be teaching. And I had that on my desk because I never assumed that they understood everything about cloud or governance or, the details behind the technology. So I never asked a question unless I couched it with what I was talking about specifically. And I didn't do it where I was condescending. I did it where, okay, as a matter of fact, I'm bringing up this topic. I need you to understand it before we're able to make a decision. And I was working for tech companies, as a CTO. And ultimately, I had a lot of work, CEOs and CFOs and things like that who knew nothing about tech. And yet they were asked to make some very strategic decisions around the use of it within the business. And so I just had to, be Professor Dave because I was the one who was tech literate, who was on the board of directors and a member of the C-suite. And ultimately, I had to bring that understanding to it and do so in a way where, kind of heart of the teacher kind of stuff.
Yeah, because they're not holding up their end of the bargain of their responsibility of duty of care. That's their main focus. And I think that kind of ignorance that a board member may have, it's not a defense, it's a liability.
Yeah, and it's interesting the way you're describing it, Dave, and in that to the extent that the board is a collegiate board and the responsibility is actually shared by the entire board, having the more tech savvy board member, if there's more than one, just play the explainer and the, opening the black box of what does it all mean so that the rest of the board members feel comfortable digging deeper into, how are the different component parts connected? What are the risks? What is the cost of those different components? It's actually an important way to elevate the digital literacy of the board as a group.
It gets them into the habit of asking questions, which is what you want.
Totally.
I want to just summarize my own understanding of a part of this segment, at least one strand of it, which I think both Meredith and David, you emphasized the idea of shared risk, shared accountability, particularly at the C-level suite and the board. But what's going to enable that, or what needs to happen, is a change of culture. As you know, Vercel, a major cloud provider, reported recently a security incident. Vercel is a major cloud provider. People have all kinds of software deployed on that, including AI technology. Let's assume for the moment that we're a company and we use Vercel extensively, and this is potentially a major incident. Could be Vercel, could be any sort of cloud provider. Just quickly give a contrast of how an organization in the status quo model is likely to respond, and then how they are likely to respond in the type of model that you're encouraging.
In the status quo model, they're not going to know how to respond. And so it's going to be very reactionary. And we saw that with the Amazon outages 6 months ago and some of the breaches of Vercel. There's a bunch of them. I hear some of you hear about, many of you don't. And they have a response team and a security team, and everybody has a chief information security officer that's going to be responsible for resolving the issue. But as far as how they work as a collective of executives, it's going to be all over the place, and it's typically going to be uncoordinated, and it's not necessarily something that's going to be planned. So there's not a plan for how that happens. There is in the security realm, but not necessarily in the executive realm. And they're going to run around in a circle and then recommend that we hire more people and get more consulting firms to look at how we're using this and depend on this technology. So that needs to change. Ultimately, in a coordination model or your ability to do things a bit different, you're going to have a shared responsibility with who owns different aspects of that. And in the case of Amazon going down, we had certain areas of the company that were owning applications where Amazon ran and they ceased to run. So what are you going to do about the resilience there? What did we learn when this thing went down? How are we going to make common changes? And the ability to implement them and their area of responsibility. So in other words, everybody's not pushing it back on the CIO or pushing it back on the CISO. They're taking responsibility for taking action within themselves in terms of how the culture needs to change, the operating models need to change, and their use of the technology needs to change to avoid these things moving forward. And by the way, that's going to get worse. Everything's getting more complex, more heterogeneous out there. The cloud providers are skimping on who's operating the systems now. They're typically using third-tier talent. And we're going to see a lot of outages and we're going to see a lot of breaches. And so ultimately, there has to be cross-ownership within the environments, or else there's not going to be a successful resolution of that. You're not going to delegate that to one particular person who's responsible for the entire security infrastructure. If that's not a team play, where everybody understands the policies and the procedures and the mechanisms behind it, it's not going to work. And so, that's where we are today. I think it's status quo is going to be unsustainable moving forward, and based on the amount of disruption we're going to see in the next 5 years.
Move on to final couple of questions. This is something that comes out in your book under this idea of wicked problems of cloud cost management. It's very, very difficult. There's surprise bills, Amazon, AWS bills shooting. No one seems to have a good handle on finance. And you mentioned FinOps as a key capability. So for a CFO listening to this, what does effective FinOps actually look like? What metrics should they be tracking? How does that connect to the board's financial oversight?
Yeah, I'll take that. There's two sides of it. Number one, what we're spending and doing what with what we're spending. So in other words, if we're spending a certain amount of money, what is that going for from an operational point of view? In other words, storage and compute and all that kind of stuff. Break it out into its functional primitive so we have enough granularity to kind of figure out what the patterns are, how we spent in the past, how we're spending now, and how we're going to be spending in the future. Fairly easy to do. The other one would be the optimization of that. So in other words, if we are spending that much money, how do we optimize our costs going forward? And even including migration. In other words, moving it to on-prem systems, which in many cases are going to be cheaper than some of the cloud systems that are out there. And looking at the optimization as something that's going to be continuously managed. So if we're dealing with governance, ultimately, kind of governance comes in the main play there because it's going to put guardrails and limitations on what we're able to spend and the things we're able to use. But ultimately, you're also getting to an optimization state where we're able to reduce the cost, basically have a viable minimum of compute resources that we're able to function, and our ability to increase the services to the business. And FinOps is providing the ability to do that because it's providing, number one, our ability to optimize using automated mechanisms, and also our ability to finally understand what the heck we're paying for. I had customers paying 6 times what they thought they were going to be paying for in the cloud, 10 years ago. And they didn't know where the money was going until they had a FinOps program in place. And finally, they figured it out. Once the visibility is there, then we can put observability around it, build it into something that's going to be much more efficient. And so that's what FinOps is at its essence. And I think FinOps is really very tactical tools in terms of cost management, but very strategic tools in understanding how policies and governance and optimization mechanisms can kind of come into play so we can continuously improve the way in which we spend the money. And by the way, that's not just cloud FinOps, that's all the FinOps. It's on-prem systems, stuff that we run in the cloud, stuff we run at the edge, all those sorts of things which comes into some sort of a centralized repository that everybody can understand. Having said that, that's nirvana. I see very few companies that have that in place. They're still using Excel spreadsheets and, reading their bills, getting their paper bills and trying to figure out what they're spending. And unless they have a handle on that, they're not going to be able to improve it.
And let me just to maybe go back to how we started, Dave, on, this utopian perspective that vendors will sell management. What part of that discourse includes a real way to actually track TCO, to track token usage, to really understand how much a company is going to spend when from the outset? What's your experience? But my humble experience is that there's very little visibility. They'll give you, okay, there's a price per token, there's a price per user, and you go figure it out how, that meets your needs or not in the coming months.
We have it at the silo. We don't have it holistically within the company. We talked about complexity and heterogeneity as being a big factor out there. Everybody's deploying whatever AI system, whatever cloud system, whatever on-prem system they need to, continuously improve their business, but they don't have a holistic cross-plane of understanding in terms of how all these things are spending money because they do so using different models. Some of them are own system where you have depreciation and energy costs. Some of them are cloud-based systems. So if I go to an enterprise, they're going to tell me what they're spending on Amazon, and it's pretty accurate, but they're not going to tell me what they're spending on aspects of Microsoft and what they're spending on Oracle, be the Oracle stuff running in their data centers. They're not going to talk about their mainframe spending because they have no visibility into that. And to me, that's kind of meaningless unless I understand how all these systems have interdependencies and how they're driving spending and events across each other and how those relate to the amount of costs that are being raised. Ultimately, I'm not getting the full message. And there's very few companies that know how to do it. In fact, I haven't seen a Global 2000 company do it. The best I've seen is a small $1 billion company that actually had some good systems that ran cross planes, but they were unfair because they were created 10 years ago. The older companies have been around for a long period of time that have many of these different silos. They know what they're spending within the silos. They don't know what they're spending as a company.
So if you could wave a magic wand and fix or improve or optimize one governance area or gap across all organizations dealing with cloud and AI, what would that be?
I'd give every board member and C-suite executive digital fluency. They don't have to be experts, but fluency, because they can't just be, I guess, observers and hoping someone else, handles it. Why it matters is because digital transformation matters. And there is a gap between what leadership wants is AI innovation and also competitive advantage, but it's disconnected from the staff ability to actually be able to do that and for the governing bodies to have meaningful oversight. We don't want governance to be compliance theater. And if it's, if they don't have digital fluency, then it's not really integrated into how they are fiduciary stewards of this, and it's not a strategic differentiator. So I think when you fix the literacy gap, everything changes, and that's where their strategic advantage comes into play.
Yeah, with me, it's easy. Stop throwing technology at these problems and accepting some kind of a different path. We're doing so now with AI. 10 years ago, we did it with cloud. Prior to that, we did it with service-oriented architecture, .com, whatever the technology du jour is, that they're going to solve the issue. Pushing stuff into your cloud provider does not relieve your responsibility. You still own those systems. You still not only have a shared risk, you're taking all the risk of running on those systems. You need to take ownership in how they're governed, how they're secured, and how they're operated. And I can't get over that enough. So people have a tendency to go to whatever the next trendy technology is to solve their issues. Basically, find a relief point in how they're going to, build and deploy their businesses. AI is probably the soup du jour at this particular time, but it's shirking your responsibility. You got to own the problem. You got to own the risk. And I think executives that don't do that moving forward aren't going to be successful.
Well, thank you, Meredith and David. One of the most powerful aspects of your book is it's not just a book. It provides a practical framework where if we implement governance in the right way, it's actually going to, in the long run, enable and accelerate innovation in AI in the cloud. So thank you again for joining AI-Dialogos.